Hello, Soul here. This is a tutorial that I'm going to write, someone requested, on how to do 2D sprites in the Blender game engine. The Blender game engine is a nice powerful engine. It's very useful, easy to use, to pick up and play with. Just by pressing the P key on your keyboard while your mouse is in the 3D view, it goes right into the game engine. It's wonderful. So it's very powerful. I've done 2D sprites with it before in the game engine. It's pretty simple to do. There's advantages and disadvantages to it, and so I'll show you pretty much how to implement it. Okay, so we have our cube here, and this will be our player, so let's name it that. Now, what we're going to do is go over here to the Logic tab and make sure it's dynamic. That will make it fall, and we'll make the collision bound a box. Now, if we press P, it'll go ahead and fall in game. Let's go ahead and go into edit mode with the tab key. Now, we're going to select all the vertices, press S, and then select 0.5. So that's basically one Blender unit in size. The default cube is 2 Blender units in size, but by pressing N to open the properties menu here, you can see that it's 1 unit wide, high, and deep. Okay, now, so that's our player cube. He will actually, this won't be what we see. This will be our invisible collision bounds that we're going to be using for the character. So to see through this, let's go to the Object tab, and under Display, select Wire. That way we don't have to look at it. And also in the Physics tab, select Invisible. Alright, now, so that's our cube. We won't be able to see it. We're just going to use it to represent our player, what he's looking like, so to speak. Now, what we're going to do is a couple of things. First, let's take a look at our workflow. We have Blender here. We have our Sprites module. This is my module that I made. It's free to use for any purpose, commercial or personal or whatever. It does the animation for us. And then we have our GIMP window, and that is our sprites that we animated. You'll probably recognize this guy from a previous tutorial that I made. Yeah, okay, so that's our guy. He looks pretty okay. Now, let's go back over here. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. And in the 2D sprites game, this is our home folder. We have the blend file next to our resource, our sprite, and our sprites module. Now, the resource can be anywhere. This Python module, the sprites module here, it doesn't have to be here, but if you want to put it somewhere else, you have to change the path, the Python path. Usually, so just be aware of that. So just for simplicity, we'll have everything here, so we don't have to worry about it so much. Now, going back to the blend file, we have our player here. So the first thing that we're going to do, and I'm going to take pretty much, this is the more roundabout approach to sprite animation, but it allows us to use multiple duplicates of sprites. A problem that some people run into is when they don't use Python to do the sprites. You don't have to, but some people use the built-in animated texture. If you duplicate objects with animated textures, they all share the same mesh, and so they all animate at the same time. So for example, if you have an explosion, creating 5 explosions at different times, they'll all share the same frame. So they'll all look like for example, you might create an explosion and it would be ending right then when you created it, which is, obviously bad. Same problem is if you do it with UV values. All the duplicate objects share the same mesh. The trick to this is to use pre-made meshes that represent the frames of animation and have an object, your sprite object, switch between those. So we're going to do that today. This is going to be our game scene, so we're going to create another scene. Copy settings. It doesn't really matter what the settings are per se. And this will be our resources scene. Now, let's go over here and make sure it's in single texture mode, just for simple animation. Make sure it's world as well. And we're going to press space and add a plane. So it doesn't matter how you add the plane, but just add a plane in. We're going to split this window over here and make a UV editor. Select the vertices, unwrap it, and so you see it's all in the UV window. We're going to go to Image and open up our sprite. Now, as you see, there's a couple of problems. First off, it's not facing correctly. You want it to be basically where Y is up, X is right. So what we can do is just rotate that around and then size it down and place it over the mesh. You'll notice that it doesn't really Okay, wait a second. Let's put on snap, but then also, okay, yeah, that's right, perfect. You notice that it's a little blurry. That's because bitmaps are on. So go to the File menu, then User Preferences, go to System, and disable bitmaps. Now it's all sharp. Okay, so this is a single frame of animation. That's it. That's the guy. So what we're going to do is name this mesh Player Walk R0. Now this matters because this influences what we define as an animation in our code. The first part is the animation name, Player Walk R, and the second part is the individual frame, 0. So what we're going to do, you probably can see this coming, we're just going to duplicate this one, go into edit mode, slide the UV map up, and this is Player Walk R1. And do it again for the other frame. This one is just a duplicate of the other frame of 0, so we'll just use 0 again. So this is Player Walk R2. So we have 0, 1, 2. 0, 1, 0, 2. That's going to be the animation sequence. Now, we have our animation cells here, and you probably noticed that they're all named plain essentially. That's because we don't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the objects are named themselves, but the sprites, the sprite themselves, the mesh names. That's what the animation, the Python script will be using. The My Sprites module will be using to animate the object. It will be using these names. So if you really want to, I probably should have done this before, but you could just name it Sprite, just so that you know what it is. Okay. Let's also give these a material. I probably should have, again, done this before. But let's go ahead and give it a sprite material. And you probably notice it turned black. Go over here to Alpha Blend, make it Alpha Clip, and we'll make it shadeless so that we don't have to worry about lighting. And we'll do this for the others as well. Okay, so we have our individual sprites here. So in order for us to be able to use these in the game scene, we need to basically put them in each scene that the game takes place in. Now the problem with this method is that if you want to spread objects around multiple scenes, one way is to press Control L, and you'll see Make Links, and you'll be able to link the object to other scenes. So for example, you could link the sprite to the game scene. The problem with this method is that you have to do this for each frame, and in addition, you have to do that for each scene. It's not really that bad, but it's kind of slow, and it's a little messy. What I like to do is to use groups, which is pretty simple. Let's create, select any of these, well, let's not select any of these, okay. Select any of these sprite frames. Go to the object menu, and then under the groups section, add a group, and we'll call this resources. So this is our resource group for our game. So any objects that need to be added into the game dynamically can find the objects from the resources group. So each time we make a new room or a level in our game, we can just add in the resources group, and it'll automatically add in each individual element that we define here. So we could go over here and say add to group, resources. And another trick that I found useful is you can select an object or several objects, then select the last object, and then the last object has to be in the group that you want. Then go to object, group, add selected to active group. So now they're all in resources. Fine. So these are all sprites, they're all there. Now what we're going to do is go back to the scene, game scene, go to a hidden layer, we'll just use the last layer, and we'll say add group instance, resources. And there it is. It's gray because it's in GLSL mode, I think. Yep, there it is. Alright, so there's our sprites. And that little crosshair is where the empty is. That's, you could say, marking their center point. That's it. Okay, so let's go back to our game here. So we have our player cube, and we're going to press Shift S, snap the cursor to selected, and we're going to add a plane. This will be the sprite that gets replaced, basically, in the animation. So now, let's go ahead and give that the sprite material, unwrap it. It doesn't really matter what frame it is, but just for simplicity, we'll use the same frame. And this will be the player SPR object. And this is the player object, so we're going to parent the sprite object to the player object. So you have the player sprite and the player bounds. So this works pretty well. Now, what I usually do is I usually link the player into the resources scene as well. I'm sorry, move the player to the resources scene. So we'll do that here. Let's move them over so that we can have a central place. Let's slide him out of the way. Have a central place where we have our resources. So if we edit a player in one position, it edits him everywhere. It's something I like to do, something that you don't really have to do depending on your game setup. You know what? That's very complex. Let me go back. That's more complex than I need to have it right now. That's just for the sake of simplicity in the tutorial, let's leave everything the way it is. So we have our resources. That's where our sprites are, and our game scene. That's where our character is. And the resources are linked in through groups. Okay, now we're going to actually implement this. Implement the player's logic to make him animate. So, we have our player here. The game logic tab is down here. We have sensors, controllers, and actuators. So this shouldn't be particularly new to you. You just add an always sensor, trigger it. This will make this script execute every frame. It's not generally recommended to have a script execute every frame, but for the player, he needs to animate every frame. Well, he doesn't need to animate every frame, but he needs to receive keyboard input, move. He needs to do that kind of thing. So it's kind of unavoidable for him. So let's connect the always sensor to the Python controller, and we're going to use module mode. Now, module mode means we're going to use an external Python module that we will write ourselves to control his game logic. So let's go back to our code. I'm using the Genie editor, by the way. It's pretty good. We're going to create a new Python file. We're going to save it. Sorry about that. I just added in the player.py file and placed it in the same directory as the sprites file, sprites.py file. So we have sprites next to our player function, our player external module, and then we have the sprite, our player sprite image, the sprite sheet. Okay, let's go back. So what we're going to do is we're going to import from BGE, import logic, and we're going to say import sprites, and we'll say define player cont, obj equals cont dot owner. Now, let's go back for a second so we can understand what's going on. This is our player, and he's going to be executing a Python function, and that function we're going to use is going to be the player.run function. Now, let me go back over here and change it so you understand. We have our player module, so that's the dot here, the player dot, that's the player module, dot run function. So this will be the code that the Blender cube, the player cube, executes. Now, let's make an initialization function. We're going to say if not init in obj init equals 1. Else return 1. Now I do this return so that we'll never have the game. I just want to make sure that it initializes for at least a frame before we start, checking for input and doing things like that. So next we're going to have define update, and we're going to pass that out just real quick. Pass means do nothing, so that's just an empty function. So we check to see if the game's been initialized, and if so, we update. Okay, so in our init function, we have pretty much nothing. We just check to see if the object's been initialized, if there's an init variable in there, and if not, we create it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to need to find the sprite file, sprite object, which you see we're not performing code on the sprite, we're doing the code on the collision box, which is recommended generally. So, because you need to have the sprite follow along the collision box, if the collision box should fall off a cliff or walk into a wall or something, you don't want the sprite lagging behind, or you don't want to have be controlling the sprite and the collision box be detecting a collision and the sprite's not responding. You want to make sure that this collision is on point. Okay, that's a poor explanation of why we use the collision box, but it's just that's the parent, so to speak, of the behavior of the object. Okay, so we're going to need to find the child, the sprite object. So we say obj sprite, this is our pointer to our sprite object, equals O40 in obj.children if spr in o.name.lower. Let me just make it simpler. O.name 0. Now, I know this is complex, but what this is saying is give us back every object for any all objects in obj.children. Obj.children is a Python list that contains a pointer to all the children of the object that you're running the script on. So we're running the script on the player object. So it looks through all the children. There's only one, that's the sprite. And it basically will return that object if its name contains SPR or sprite, which our object does contain that name, player SPR. Now it's Python's case sensitive, so make sure it's capitalized correctly. So if you go ahead and say print obj sprite and run the game, oops. He just disappeared, which isn't good. Hold on. Okay, well, it did work. This is lagging. It did work. It did print the name of our object, of our sprite object, player SPR. So that's great. Now let's go back over here. Let's make sure that the sprite doesn't have any physics collision enabled. And that might have been the issue, possibly. Hold on. Yep, that was the issue. You see, when the sprite was collision enabled, the object would fly off. I couldn't see because it was lagging, but I think it was flying off. But with the sprite disabled, with the sprite's collision disabled, is easy as pie, so to speak. Okay, now back to our code. So we have our code, our sprite object, and from here it's not actually that complex. We're just going to say sprites. We're going to call our sprite animation function from our sprites module. So there's only two sprite animation functions in my module, sprite and sprite mesh, and both can take an argument of which object you want to animate. So we're going to use our sprite object for animation. Now the idea behind this, this is using the second, pretty much the more preferred method of animating your sprite, which is sprite mesh, which means it's going to swap out your sprite's mesh, which is this one, for the animation frames in your that you linked in, one of these, and it'll do that every so often so that it goes ahead and creates an animation. You'll see it better once it's finished. Okay, so let's actually implement this. We just type in before our sprite mesh function call, or after, it doesn't really matter, but you probably want it before. You say obj sprite spr anim equals this. This is an array. Now this will be what animation we want our object to play. So I made it so that the first argument you enter for a list is the name of you say the base name of each frame, which is player walk R, and then the next arguments are the frames we want to use. So the animation list we're going to use is player walk R, and then 0, 1, 0, 2. So that means that it will switch between player walk R0, and then 1, and then 0, and 2. And I'll give the effect of walking. And I believe it should work pretty much right now. He's falling, but he's falling, but it's working. Now you probably noticed that it rotates. That's because, like I mentioned, it's switching out the sprite. And the sprites are upward, facing upward. So what I'm going to do to fix this is we can do this two ways. One way is to rotate each sprite like this. Or if you want to be consistent and just have all your sprites facing upward, you can rotate this one just for simplicity. I'm going to have it face the same direction, and then rotate its object up 90, which means that the objects all are rotated to face that way as well. So we're going to add a ground plane so that he doesn't fall out of the shot so we can see it. And that's it. He's animating. Now you probably see it's choppy. That's because of recording the video, but it's working pretty well. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If you want to change the animation, you can use any other list. If you want to do anything else, it's pretty simple. Okay, so thank you for watching. That was a Blender tutorial on how to do 2D sprite animation in the Blender game engine. I appreciate your watching. If you want to donate to help fund more tutorials or fund development of my other projects, feel free to do so. If you have a comment, please leave it in the comment section. I would appreciate any constructive criticism. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's it. Thanks for watching.